Hello and a very warm welcome to the program, People, Politics and Power. I am Imonia Marere. In a world marked by interconnected economies and global trade systems, the outbreak of armed conflict does more than redraw political boundaries or shift military alliances. It sends shockwaves through markets, devastates national economies, and distorts long-term development projects. The economic consequences of war are no longer confined to the battlefield. Their ripple across continents, destabilize supply chains, inflating energy and commodity prices, and crippling national budgets. The Russia-Ukraine war, now well into its third year, has not only decimated infrastructure and displaced millions, but has also upended the global energy and food supply, especially in Europe and parts of Africa. Ukraine's grain exports and Russia's oil and gas flows have been weaponized, leading to inflation, food insecurity, and economic strain far beyond the borders of the conflict. Now, similarly, the tensions between Israel and Iran, especially during the 12-day war and the broader Middle East volatility, pose continuous threats to regional trade, global oil markets, and investor confidence. And now the emerging specter of conflict between the United States and Russia, following the deployment of nuclear submarines by the United States near Russia, could send energy prices soaring and undermining global economic recovery efforts. Beyond immediate destruction, wars divert critical public funds from health, education, and social welfare to military spending. They damage investor sentiment, reduce productivity, and entrench cycles of poverty. In the long term, conflicts leave nations grappling with debt, weakened currencies, and battered human capital. On the program today, we shall examine the impact of conflicts, not just as political flashpoints, but as catalysts of economic disruption and global instability. This is our focus, and I'm joined on the program by three experts in this area. I'm joined first by Professor Joshua Bolarinwa. He's the Acting Director of Research at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs in Lagos. Professor Bolarinwa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon.
Welcome. Also joining us is Professor Godwin Ichimi. Professor Ichimi is the Director of International Cooperation and Public Affairs at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs in Lagos. Professor Ichimi, thank you for joining us. All right, we'll wait for Professor Ichimi to join us very shortly, but at the moment we are joined by Professor Mukhtar Imam, Professor of International Relations and Directing Staff at the National Institute for Security Studies. Professor Imam, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Welcome. All right, we will take a short break, and when we return in a moment, we will be diving straight into our discussion.
The Nigeria we need is the united, indissoluble, and cohesive Nigeria, which guarantees equity, fairness, justice, and prosperity for its citizens. That is our focus on people, politics, and power. It is fresh, insightful, impactful. It's a must-watch. People, politics, and power on AIT.
Thank you so much for staying with us. Let's dive into our discussion now. Conflicts and the toll they have on economies and social life generally across the globe. Well, let's begin this way, Professor Obolarinwa. Let's begin perhaps from the most immediate, which is the nuclear tension that is beginning to brew between the United States and Russia. What do you think could be the immediate impact of such tensions?
There is a lot of impact in the tension that is building between the United States and the Russian Federation. This is as a result of the geopolitical conflict or the dispute that is happening between Russia and Ukraine, which is spanning about 3 years now. And over time, attempts have been made by the global community to stop this conflict, to stop this war, and to reduce tension in that region or between the two countries. But over time, all attempts, particularly multilateral attempts, the United Nations, other regional international organizations, the entire international communities, and other nations, they have basically intervened in order to reduce the impact of this tension of conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But the new dimension is the deployment of nuclear arsenals or nuclear equipment to Ukraine against Russia by the United States. That is a very serious problem, and it's a new dimension in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A new dimension in the sense that, first of all, such a conflict, such a geopolitical conflict or war that has limited scope, but global dimension or global effect. It's not expected to have the use of nuclear weapons or nuclear arsenals or nuclear equipment against each other or one another. It is not good and it's not going to end well. But I want to believe it is only a threat. It is only a threat because even between the US and the Russian Federation, or call it the former Soviet Union, there is this agreement of mutual assured destruction between the two countries that they will not use nuclear equipment, nuclear weapons against each other. There's no amount of provocation, there's no amount of challenge or problem that will arise or that will occur between the two of them. But US, in trying to help Ukraine and trying to bring Russia to the negotiating table in order to dialogue and resolve this conflict, US is trying to bring this dimension to it by trying to order the deployment of nuclear arsenal to Ukraine against Russia. The effect will be abundant. The effect will be so much that it's not going to be limited to the geographical location where your Russia and Ukraine conflict is going on now, and not also going to be limited to even Eastern Europe or Europe as a whole, but it's going to have a global impact. It's going to have a global dimension to it because we are talking about nuclear weapons. We are talking about nuclear weapons, which is not acceptable and which should not be acceptable in any ramification. It will have economic impact, it will have social impact, it will have political impact, and it will have so much impact that it should not be allowed and it should not go a long way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's bring in Professor Imam at this point in time. Prof, how do you see this playing out? I mean, the current tensions between the two major superpowers in terms of the deployment of nuclear arsenals, getting ready, as it were, to march on each other. How do you see it playing out?
Well, thank you very much. If this gets to the level where the deployment of the nuclear arsenals are allowed to be launched or used in the ongoing conflict, it's going to have obviously a very devastating effect it is going to have tremendous effect or impact on human casualty. Of course, we know the impact of nuclear, how much kilometer radius the use of nuclear could cover in whatever circumstances. And so the use of nuclear armament in this conflict, the ongoing war, will have catastrophic effect. It will have toll on its human casualty. It will affect society in its ramification. But beyond just the immediate impact that use of nuclear weapon will have on human suffering as we currently have it, it will have opened up the Pandora box. It will have allowed for the use of a weaponry that the world is trying as much as it can at multilateral level, at state levels, and so on and so forth, to ensure that we do not see a carnage caused by a nuclear war. If this precedent is set, then it is not going to augur well for the world. Remember that the United States and Russia are not the only countries that have nuclear arsenals or nuclear armaments. There are a number of other countries as well. And considering where we are today, considering the alignment and realignment of postures of countries within the international system, the reality is that we will begin to see partner countries or countries that are in alignment with either Russia or the United States take side with either parties. And that is going to have a serious ramification for the entire world. And that is the kind of devastation that the world is not ready for. And so this politicking around conflict today led by the United States is something that should be condemned by international regimes. It's something that we need to see a withdrawal from, because you see, part of the reasons why we had the First World War, or in my view, beyond just the immediate trigger in Sarajevo that essentially killed the prince, the Austro-Hungarian prince. Part of the reasons that led to the First World War, the first is, in my view, ebullient militarism. We had too many arms, empires were bragging to themselves, and the only way to test out your weapons, and remember, this was the height of the Industrial Revolution, which essentially was about arms proliferation, particularly in the United States and other parts of Europe, of course. And the only way to test out that, bragging right was to, confront one another. And so the war broke out. The second reason that led to that with the First World War was what, in my view, is aggressive nationalism led by Napoleon Bonaparte. And the third reason, of course, is insatiable imperialism, the desire to conquer the world, etc., etc. Now, the First World War caused the Second World War. And the Second World War is what has led to the Cold War, which we're still experiencing today. Of course, that is debatable. Some believe it has ended, but we still see remnants of the Cold War still with us today. Now, three reasons have essentially helped to forestall the rise of a Third World War. The first is what I call the mutual assured destruction, or the principle of the mutual assured destruction. The second is the nuclear utilization target selection. And the third is the growing interdependence among nation states, which we're beginning to see wane today as a result of this alliance and realliance. Multilateralism is beginning to take the backstage, and we're seeing ultra-nationalist figure rear their heads, like the case of America First policy of Donald Trump in the United States, and so on and so forth, which essentially is not good for world politics, not at the time that we are in today. Added to that is the threat of the use of nuclear armaments, which the United States essentially is leading because of the idiosyncrasy of the man who's at the helms of affairs of the United States today. So my take is that the use of nuclear armament is going to have a global ramification, because believe in you me, North Korea is not going to stand by and watch the devastation that Russia is going to face as a corollary, or as an outcome, as a consequence of the deployment or use of nuclear armaments by Ukraine, backed by the United States. And you also find that NATO is also not going to fold its arms as well. So this is going to have an even more devastating impact on human lives, on the economy, on the social fabric of society. And I hope that we do not get to that point, because it appears we're edging much more closer to a third world war than we ever have.
Professor Abolane, we are talking about the Third World War. When the United Nations was created or came into being in 1945, it was with the aim of ensuring that there is no more wars. But since 1945, when the United Nations came into existence, it appears that there have been more wars, small as they may be, in different geopolitical spaces around the world than before the United Nations came into existence. So beginning from, say, the Russian-Ukraine war, the Israeli-Iran crisis, the crisis in Syria, in Africa here you have the crisis in Sudan, you have the crisis in the DR Congo. All over the place, there are wars and there are conflicts, there is violence and all of that. Now, what impact do these wars have on national and international economies as they occur?
Wars always have a lot of impact on the people, on the environment, on the nations, on the regions, and even globally. So there are so many impacts that wars, all of these wars we are talking about. If you take it historically from the creation of the United Nations, which actually in the preamble of its charter that says twice in our lifetime, humanity had witnessed 2 devastating world wars. And thereafter, we created this in order to ensure peace and security, tranquility, international cooperation, and so on and so forth. But beyond that, we had the Cold War, and although the Cold War that majorly occurred between the US and the then Soviet Union, now Russian Federation, they did not actually go against each other, but there were proxy wars across the continents, across the world, regions, and everywhere, as you mentioned. There have been so many effects of these wars on humanity, on the economy, on political environment. But the critical impact of some of these wars, or most of these wars, from Russia-Ukraine war to this Israel-Iran war, to Israel-Palestinian crisis, to all of these crises, there are so many impacts. One of the major socioeconomic effects is regional instability. Regional instability. Conflicts of this nature, they lead to destabilization of the entire region or regions, having global dimension, causing humanitarian crisis and displacement across the world. Apart from that, there will be majorly economic disruptions. Economic disruptions are the most monumental impact that comes from all of these wars. It is because there will be trade disruptions. There will be no free flow of trade. Trade will not go on. Take, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war had caused a lot of trade disruptions in the last 3 years. Russia and Ukraine, they supply about 65% to 70% global wheat. But since the war started between the two countries, the supply chain had been disrupted. Not only disrupted, it's affecting both Ukraine and Russia, and more importantly, those who wants to buy them, the consumers, Africa, Latin America, part of Europe, where these wheat and these cereals have been supplied to, they are seriously affected. Another impact, another socioeconomic impact, apart from trade disruption, is inflation. Because the supply is affected, now there will be increase in prices of these commodities. There will increase in prices of wheat, sorghum, and other cereals coming from that region because other suppliers are bringing it with higher prices. There's also increase in energy, global energy crisis, increase in crude oil prices, increase in gas supply, increase in all of these problems are major economic disruptions coming from those wars. Apart from trade, inflation, energy crisis, there are also economic crisis or economic impact of sanctions. Sanctions have been placed on on Russia by NATO, by the European Union, by the US, and other Western countries, including the US, even Canada. Some other countries have placed a lot of sanctions on Russia as a result of this war. Apart from economic sanctions, there will be problems of unemployment internally in Ukraine, internally in Russia, internally even in Iran and other places where all of these geopolitical conflicts are thriving. So there are so many economic impacts, so many economic disruptions. Apart from that, there is endemic poverty being strengthened. There is poverty already, but the poverty across the globe is entrenched. Look at Sudan, look at the Sahel, look at countries like Burkina Faso, Niger, look at those places, look at that geopolitical region of Sahel. A lot of problems, a lot of political instability, security threats, increased radicalization, increased extremism, all of these affecting trade flow, all of this causing inflation, all of this causing endemic unemployment, endemic poverty, and it's entrenching poverty, and it's causing a lot of more problems. And this is also disrupting trade and flow of trade across the world. Beyond that, these geopolitical conflicts, from the Sahel to Sudan to Ukraine and Russia to the Middle East, Iran and Israel, and everywhere we have all of these conflicts across the world today, there is increased instability and there is increased mortality rates. And this is affecting the youth population. It's affecting the economy. It's affecting the political stability. It's affecting the entire environment and the ecospace. And these are the major socioeconomic and even political impact of this conflict, of these wars, particularly these increasing or increased geopolitical conflict, violence, and crisis across the world.
Professor Imam, let's take that a little further a bit. Let's look at some of the figures that have been rolled out as a result of these global conflicts and the related violence that have occurred. 2024 figures indicate that there was an economic loss of well over $17.5 trillion, which represents about 13% of the global gross domestic product, GDP. And those crises or those conflicts and those violence have also caused a huge dip in conflict zones, particularly in areas like the Middle East, in Ukraine and Russia, in places like Sudan. And these crisis areas, we have seen a minus 45% dip in the gross domestic product of in these conflict regions. And one begins to wonder, the relationship between these conflicts, the economies of these countries and the regions, as Dr. Bolarewa has stated, and the long-term impact on social life.
Well, absolutely. So every society exists on its triangles, its political, economic, and social dimension, every society. And so wherever there are disruptions, the natural consequence of that is that people suffer devastating loss, lives and livelihood are threatened, and so on and so forth. Now, the numbers you have just reeled out are absolute reality. As a matter of fact, a lot of studies have been conducted with regards to the impact of wars, the global impact of wars on economies. And one of them is that was conducted by the Watson Institute for International and Public Relations. And they revealed, like you rightly mentioned, that about $20 trillion has been lost to the global economy as a result of the devastation of wars. And this is no, this is, I mean, when you contrast that with the number of poverty or people living in poverty across the world today, it tells you that we can actually feed that number twice, three, or even four times, fourfold with the resources that have been lost to global conflict. So yes, this is something that has devastating consequences. And the truth of the matter is, when you look beyond the conflict themselves through to the issues there that lies therein, you come to the conclusion, or you're forced to conclude, that certain conflict profiteers or war profiteers are taking advantage of these conflict situations and are enriching themselves unnecessarily. I mean, look at the numbers that have been rolled out again by the Watson Institute. It states that about $5 trillion have been expended from the period of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan up till this moment. In fact, just the war in or the genocide that's been carried out in Palestine today, in Gaza, the United States has spent about 3 to 4 billion US dollars in sustaining that genocide. And you see, when these things go on and on, the devastation that it creates ripple effect as far as its devastation is concerned. And the people, the human casualty, the cost of lives, the cost of livelihood, the impact that it inflicts upon the social fabric of society weighs a lot on these environments. We see what happened on the Strait of Hormuz, for example, when the Yemenis decided to block that strait as a result of their allegiance or support to what is happening in Palestine. It had ripple effect. It created a lot of devastation as far as global economy is concerned. So the reality is, like you stated in your introduction, when these wars go on, the consequences are felt by immediate communities, and not just the immediate communities. It also transcends the borders of national economies to have regional and, of course, international effect, which is largely devastating.
And then let's talk about the impact on health, on education, and social protection systems, because the figures
Right.
are really, really very disarming. In terms of global food insecurity, close to 70% of people are going hungry in many of these conflict hotspots across the world. And in terms of education, the last figure that was read out a few months back indicates that about 222 million children across the world are not getting education as a result of conflicts and violence in many of these geopolitical regions. And then, of
Absolutely.
course, one begins to think what the developed countries of the world that supply the arms to these countries for these conflicts think of what they are doing when they hear or see of these figures.
Absolutely. With regards to health, you see, like I said in the beginning, every society is governed by its triangle, its political, economic, and social dimensions. And so health is an integral part of every society. Even before this was escalated to this level, the United Nations arm on health, the WHO, reeled out a statistic that said that in Nigeria, that there are 5,000 patients to one medical doctor and 10,000 patients to one bed space within the health space, which is basically a far cry from the ratio that the WHO has essentially mandated that countries should stop by or stick by. This is a far cry from that. What the WHO says is that there should be at least 1,000 patients, 1,000 patients to one medical doctor, and here we are. Now imagine the blowback that these wars would have created beyond just the economic impact that it will have on the health sector. The same about education. The United Nations Secretary General in one of his address recently, stated that there are over 374 million internally displaced persons or even refugees. He categorized them as internally displaced, but then, of course, that also includes refugees as well across the world as a result of conflicts, the devastation that conflicts have created. And the toll of this is on women and children. We see what is happening across the Gaza Strip. The most affected are women and children, babies being burnt alive, babies being thrown, women being displaced, and so on and so forth. So education is not even a priority as far as this is concerned. Because first of all, it's about survival. This is the priority for people at this time. Nobody's even talking about the health facilities. Nobody's talking about other things as well. So you find that wherever these conflicts play out, wherever these conflicts ensue, the toll is more on women and children. And like I said, from the statistics that has been reeled out over the years, you find that the numbers are exponentially increasing by the day. And speaking of those who are in the arms business, you would recall in 1960 when President Dwight Eisenhower, the former president of the United States, made an address. He said something very pivotal. He said, or pivotal rather, he said that the United States must ensure that it doesn't enslave itself to the military-industrial complex. What we see playing out here is the United States giving itself up to the military-industrial complex. And all of these have started essentially after 9/11. The first amendment was invoked to ensure that arms proliferation continued. The United States, with a population of just 300 million people, has over 300 million guns in its civilian population or amongst the civilian population after 9/11. So it's safe to say everybody owns a gun in the United States. Post 9/11 till today, the expenditure of Pentagon has increased exponentially, and the individuals, or rather the groups or companies, the private companies, are the ones that have been benefiting from this. Notco, for example, RTX, for example, Boeing, for example, all of these private companies have essentially, taken a chunk of the resources of the United States as a result of more expenditure in arms. And this is something that happens all around the world because, like Dwight Eisenhower said, where you find that you proliferate arms, what it does is that it exacerbates tension in the economies of your neighbors, and they will also want to out-arm you. And like I said in the beginning, this was the major reason that led to the First World War in the first place. And so, when these private companies emasculate, when they hijack government and institutions of government, what it does is that it allows them to flood the economies of countries with arms, and they are not concerned in whose hands these arms fall into. The end user certificate essentially is of no use in the modern world which we are today, because we see arms that are being procured that should end in second user country that are being used in third user countries, for example. And so tons of weapons of destruction are dropped in Haifa and the Gaza Strip and so on and so forth, bearing the United States symbol, which is essentially not what the arms treaty propagates. So it has had devastating effect, and it is still having these devastating effects on all ramifications of society, like you have mentioned.
Professor Bolariwa, that takes us to our next line of discussion, which is to ask the question: are we seeing a new arms race in the world today? And what would that mean, if it is true? What would that mean for development financing and indeed poor nations of the world that cannot afford these arms and cannot afford to join in the arms race? And I refer you to what happened a few weeks back. When President Trump came into power, he was, even before he came into power, he was very opposed to the supply of arms to Ukraine in the war against Russia. But somewhere along the line a few weeks back, he now says, look, members of NATO, European countries that have been supporting Ukraine, can now buy arms and supply to Ukraine for its war against Russia. And those arms can only be procured from the United States of America. In other words, the US is more interested, as it were, in selling its arms rather than indeed in bringing an end to that war that has been on for over 3 years. So what does this mean for development financing and for poor countries of the world?
Thank you. Of course, in the situation of incidences of wars, violent conflicts, crises across the world, it is important, and it is also one of the major consequences that there will be arms race and increase in arms production and even armament. And if you look at the world today, generally, you will see that armament has basically increased across the world. And nations who does not, nation that does not, nations who don't have uranium production or uranium enrichment leading to nuclear warheads or nuclear weapons or armaments are all striving to have it, including Iran and others. While some have had it, some are also bidding and struggling to have it. Beyond that, today there is increase in arms production, increase in armament, increase in even rifles and all other weapons of war. Of course, these are actions of man. It is only man who produces weapons, who distributes weapons, and who sells the weapons and selling it to nations. And weapons can only be sold in the situation of war or wars as we have across the globe. And basically, that is why there is increase in armament. And this increase in armament is affecting development financing. This increase in armament is affecting budgeting for development, budgeting to reduce poverty, budgeting for health, budgeting for education, budgeting for the environment, owing to the fact that there's also an increasing impact of the climate change on humanity, on the environment, on the economy, and even on nations generally. So the increase in armament has led to decrease in financing for development. It is also affecting countries, particularly poor countries, in tackling poverty effectively. Beyond that, armament is also increasing situations of war across the globe. I could remember during the period of Joseph Biden as the US president, most of the weapons that US was giving to Ukraine, most of those weapons were Iranian weapons seized. But these weapons were produced by Russia for Iran. And Iran have been using these weapons and selling these weapons across the world, in the Sahel, in Sudan, beyond Africa, even in Somalia at the same time. Across the world, they've been selling this. Iran too has been selling all of this. Turkey has been selling most of these weapons. So armament has increased. And the increase in armament is seriously affecting the desire for development, the desire to reduce poverty, the desire to create more employment opportunities for the teeming youth population across the world. Because currently there is youth bulge in Africa, youth bulge in Asia, youth bulge in Europe, youth bulge even in America. And there is need for employment, to increase employment opportunities for them. So as a result of this now, the increase in armament, the increase in weapons production, armament, firearms, which all of these have been fueling wars across the globe, including Ukraine, including Iran, even in Israel, even in Palestine, and in the Sahel. Sudan is seriously unstable. All of these are caused by the increase in armament, weapons production and distribution and proliferation. And all of these are causing conflicts, are fueling conflicts, are driving conflicts, and increasing conflict across the globe. And this is also increasing deaths, mortality rates. This is causing it and creating more humanitarian emergencies across the world, leading to humanitarian crisis, affecting hygiene, affecting the environment, affecting people's lives, causing displacement, causing instability, and creating a situation where economic issues, economic development cannot thrive. but conflict, but violence, but killings, but instability, and so many issues of humanitarian emergencies and crises, unemployment issues. So increase in armament is affecting development across the world. And this is also affecting financing for development, particularly in developing countries, especially in poor countries across Africa, Latin America, and part of Asia. If that is not stopped, war will take over everywhere. And apart from war, apart from crisis and violence, the problem of climate change is also causing conflict. It's also creating problems. And that will be another dimension to the disasters that will be happening to humanity, to countries, to regions, and to countries and to people, which will be affecting development continuously. So increase in armament is affecting financing for development, affecting financing for or to tackle poverty across the world. And all of these have also led to increase in situations and incidences of war across the globe.
Professor Imam, let's bring this a little bit nearer home. Let's bring it to Africa, for instance. How these conflicts, whether in Europe or in Asia or in the Middle East, how they are impacting governance in Africa, democracy, and of course, civic space in our different countries across the continent.
Well, like we've been saying, the impact of wars are ripple. Forgive my connection, please. I noticed it's breaking. The impacts of wars are ripple. Wars have ripple effect on not just the economies of countries that are waging the war, those that the wars are waged against. Wars have, a multi-dimensional effect. It cuts beyond just the borders of particular countries. And the impact of that is felt right here in Africa. Let's take, for example, the case of Ukraine, that is a major supplier to most countries, Africa included, of wheat, own about 70 to 75% of that. Russia, for example, has about 60 to 70% of the channels through which gas is being supplied to the rest of the world. So typically, wherever conflicts ensue, when we have wars on this dimension, on a global scale, the impact of that is not just going to be on developing economies, is also going to be on on developed economies, but will also have a ripple effect on emerging economies as well. These are economies that are already struggling, trying to get their acts together as far as development and democracy is concerned, because one cannot exist without the other. As Robert McNamara has rightly pointed out, development is security and security is development. Where you find that insecurity thrives, which is what these wars have created, they create room for crisis within democratic spaces. And this is the impact of some of the things that we're witnessing today. The rise of Boko Haram, the rise of other insurgent groups, the internationalization of terror channels and terror groups, and what gives them impetus is, as a result of one of them, is the fall of the Muammar Gaddafi regime in Libya, for example, which created, because Gaddafi had tremendous weapons in his arsenal. He had a cache of weapons. And so as soon as the regime fell, these arms began to find their ways. As a matter of fact, from one of the studies conducted, there were over 400 small and light weapons in Libya. And that's the reason why today it has been discovered that there is at least one RPG rifle to 4 families in Libya. You can imagine the level of harm and devastation that will create. And these are some of the weapons that have found their way through sub-Saharan Africa, into West Africa, into the hands of Boko Haram in places like Sambisa Forest and so on and so forth. And this has consistently created, discord, instability across the Sahel region, across the entire West Africa, and governance has become much more challenging, because this is a continent where we're grappling with some of the dividends of governance. According to the African governance architecture, which is a framework that was developed by the AU in its 28th ordinary session to develop milestones, to develop metrics, to understand how governance fares across the African continent. It has given a below pass mark, and that grade keeps depreciating by the day as far as all of the indices are concerned: transformative leadership, provision of good governance, meeting the Human Development Index. All of these things have seen a decline, a retrogression as a result of the consistent wars and proxy wars that we're witnessing across the African continent. Take Sudan, for example. It is an economy that is today devastated by wars because of certain external interests, because of the interest of the UAE on one side, and of course, the interest of France and Italy and its allies on the other side. So, these are some of the crises that we are witnessing, that we are a victim of, as a result of the actions or inactions of certain individuals. Just because the United States wants Boeing, for example, to make more money, just because the United States is interested in Lockheed Martin's making more money, just because the United States is interested in seeing that General Dynamics, for example, enriches itself. And so, because we wants to enrich certain individuals, because the military industrial complex has to make more money, nobody cares about the impact that these arms will have on emerging economies like ours, for example. And so you find like that people like Trump will comfortably withdraw from the Small and Light Weapons Treaty at the United Nations and not care, will comfortably withdraw from NAFTA and not care, will comfortably not be concerned about the impact that these wars will have on emerging economies, on governance, on shrinking the civil space. Because where people do not find comfort, there is absolutely no way they will be willing to go out there and exercise their franchise. So these are some of the devastating impacts and effects of global wars on emerging economies, and we are likely to see these go on much more in the coming years if this trend is not nipped in the bud.
All right, Professor Bolariwa, as we round off our discussion, we now must begin to look for possible solutions. And I'm beginning to ask this question. What should low-income or low and middle-income countries of the world, such as we have in Africa, what lessons can they learn from what is going on at the moment? And what lessons can they learn from the economic vulnerabilities that conflicts, wars, and violence creates in various countries of the world and in the global system?
Basically, developing countries across the world, particularly African countries, what we can learn, what we can do coming from all of these geopolitical conflicts across the world, the impact on everything, is that African countries should learn to look inward now. African countries should learn to look inward, strengthen all mechanisms domestically, security, economy, political aspect of the economy. Everything should be well structured and put in place and strengthen them. Beyond this, strong political leadership. Strong political leadership is a necessity to take some of these decisions that will help most developing countries across the world. Because if a developing country or a poor country degenerates its situation into a war, then that country will take decades before it can pick up. Take, for example, what is happening in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger. How long will it take them to reduce poverty, provide employment opportunities for a steaming population? And how long will it take them to say, okay, this is what we have to do, how we have to go about it, what we should do accordingly? All I believe is that strong political leadership, strengthening domestic mechanisms, and trying to straighten up the economy in our own way to address our local needs, national needs, will go a long way. Then employment opportunities should be created for the teeming population, particularly the youth, because idle hands, they are the ones that go into bad situations or conflict or a lot of other problems. They are the ones who become the extremists, the bandits, and the kidnappers over there. So when job opportunities, when employment opportunities are created for the teeming population, especially the youth, the economy is being taken care of, employment created, and strong political leadership. More importantly, corruption should be nipped in the bud. Corruption causes a lot of problems, and corruption creates a lot of extended effects, ripple effects, or what we call effects that causes other effects or creates other problems. If corruption is also nipped in the bud, then security will be guaranteed, the economy will be protected, employment opportunities will be created, the environment will be protected, then the youth will be engaged, constructively engaged. Jobs will be provided for the youth. And I believe that there will be stability. There will be stability and there will be continuity. Then there will be progress. Then conflict will be reduced.
Thank you so much, Professor Imam. Let me point you in the direction of regional institutions and international bodies like the AU, the UN, the Asian country groups and all of that, what role these groups can play in mitigating the economic consequences of conflicts and wars and violence in these various regions of the world. Professor Imam, can you hear me?
Okay, I'll assume you have landed and you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right then. Okay, so very quickly, so the AU, for example, in its agenda 2063, talks about a very pointy and noteworthy framework or model or policy, which is silencing the gun. It is a central theme of the AU Agenda 2063. And I believe that if that is sustained and the conversation goes beyond just rhetorics, and it can be impacted, or rather it can be entrenched across the African continent, it will go a long way in helping to salvage the situation. And this should be replicated across board. You know, it is something that all international regimes should begin to speak about. The concept or the principle of denuclearization, demilitarization, and disarmament. We should consistently, return back to this conversation. Trump can withdraw from the Small and Light Weapons Treaty all he wants. And by the way, that has also sparked a reaction from his Russian counterpart, who has also decided to withdraw. And these were the initial signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is what essentially we call the Small and Light Weapons Treaty. Now, where these emerging economies come in is on the need to ensure that, like you rightly mentioned, across regional levels, that the conversation is constantly had to ensure that the proliferation of arms, the constant militarization of the world is reduced to the barest minimum level. Because the truth of the matter is this: when you take the statistics of the United States, which I reeled out earlier, for example, post 9/11, there have been more than 300 million weapons in the United States. Now ask yourself a question: has the United States been more secure after 9/11 than it was before 9/11? It goes to tell you that the proliferation of arms, that kinetic measures, are not in themselves sufficient to solve or address the problems of security around the world. And so we must constantly interrogate these issues. At the United Nations level, there's a need for a common front. 50 plus countries are strong enough to be able to make a position known as far as the United Nations General Assembly is concerned, even though we do not have a permanent seat at the Security Council, we must consistently talk about the proliferation of arms and who stands to profit from the proliferation of these arms. Because where there are manufacturers, we are the receiving end. We are consumers of these weapons. And when these weapons get to this part of the world, they end up in random hands. And so we find ourselves constantly interrogating the issues of security. And so this needs to be done. On the flip side, we are faced with three deficits. There's a deficit in governance, which has created a deficit in development, and that has in turn created a deficit in peace. We need to bridge the gap.
Thank you so
Governance,
much.
good governance has to be restored and returned to the African continent for us to make any meaningful progress.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukhtar Imam. He's a professor of international relations and a directing staff of at the National Institute for Security Studies. Thank you so much for your time. I'm Professor Joshua Bolarinwa. He's the acting director of research at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs in Lagos. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Right, that's our program for today. We want to thank you, our viewers, for investing your time on us today, and we look forward to bringing you another edition of the program when we meet you again. Bye for now.